This is a 2008 Jeep Compass with the 2.4 liter engine, and it's over here because it's got a engine noise, specifically a whine. And friends of mine that brought it over have kind of fallen on hard times and don't have a lot of money, and figured I'd help them out a little bit. And I think I know what the problem is, and the shop also said that this might be the problem. And if you look down in there, that's the alternator on the very bottom, and you can see some kind of dried up grease being slung out on the frame of the alternator there, that brown looking stuff. And what's driving that alternator is a Overrunning Alternator Decoupling pulley, or for short just a decoupler pulley. You can see how much longer that pulley is, how much farther it extends from the belt. And what appears to be going on is the grease has dried up on the bearing on that pulley, and a powdery residue is being flung off onto the frame of the alternator that you can see on the front there, that brown stuff. And shop wanted $350 to replace that, and they just didn't have the money. And part of the reason why they wanted that much money is the alternator is very difficult to replace. A lot of stuff has to come off. As you can see, there's absolutely no room to work on this engine. And the engine is, part of the reason is the engine is transverse mounted, which is just horrible. It's the work of the devil almost. It's just very difficult to work on these engines, especially the belt drive system. But part of the reason why they wanted so much money is the difficulty of the job, and also the fact that they wanted to replace the entire alternator assembly and not just the pulley. And I think that alternator is 115 amp. I think it retails around $250. And I found a way that I think I can replace that pulley. I went ahead and ordered the tools. I went ahead with the Gates original unit, and that's what this pulley looks like. It's actually made by Lightens. You can see it better there. And what this is the bearing on the back end of it that I think that it's failed. And what this allows the alternator to do is it spins in one direction to drive the alternator, but freewheels in the other direction. So one of the other things I'm going to do is also give them an oil change. It's going to take some 5W20 oil. The oil is long overdue for an oil change, so I'll give an oil and filter change. I'll go ahead and do that first. And then I'll get into getting the alternator out of here and go over a procedure to work that pulley off of there and do the replacement and see if that solves the noise. I would demonstrate the noise for you, but it's actually a situation where the noise was caught very early. It's barely perceptible, and this engine has a drive-by wire, so I can't really rev the engine up out here. It has to actually be inside the car, and it's actually just almost imperceptible, but it's there. So I think we're getting to this at just the right moment. But let me go ahead and get started with the oil change first and get that out of the way. And I'm not sure if I'll film that. It's pretty easy to do. There's the oil pan, and there's the drain bolt right there. It's 13 millimeter. And there's the oil filter. Pretty easy to get to. I've got several other oil change videos on my channel there. This procedure to change the oil in this car is going to be exactly the same. You just drain the oil from the pan there into the drain container, and then take off the filter and put the new one on. So let me go ahead and get the oil change out of the road, and then we'll get to working on that alternator. Okay, the old oil is draining out, and as you can see, that's pretty nasty looking stuff. And I got the drain bolt here, and you just want to make sure that that's all clean. Clean up around that gasket mating surface there, as well as around the fitting on the oil pan. And while that's draining, I'm going to go ahead and see if I can get that filter loose. It looks like I can just use a regular filter wrench for that. Let me get that wrench and I'll be right back. Okay, I've got the new filter completely full, pre-charged with oil, and the O-ring gasket lubricated with oil. This car calls for a 5W20 oil. And one of the other things you guys want to do is clean off the oil filter adapter really well. And so this filter is actually pretty straightforward. Just go ahead and thread it on by hand. And we see that we have the wrong fit. No, it's going to fit. That was kind of a little difficult to get on there. Looks like the threads are okay. Let's try again. That's one of the things you want to do when you do it yourself, is to make sure that you don't cross-thread it. That could have very easily been cross-threaded. That's how they're supposed to spin on. But you can see that I had a little bit of trouble getting that on there initially. So you want to start off being real careful and just kind of rock it back and forth to just make sure that you get a good smooth motion with those threads. And now you can feel it contacting the adapter. Once it contacts, just give it a few turns. Doesn't have to be extremely tight. That ought to do it. And then you're basically done. I need to, one of the things I forgot to mention, I had to use the strap wrench to get the filter off there. There just wasn't enough clearance on this car with the AC compressor and the frame member here for the regular conventional wrench. So now what we have to do is go ahead and add our oil. 4.5 quarts for the pan and the filter. We'll add the oil, start the engine, check the level, and then we'll reset the oil monitoring system. Now this car has a oil change monitoring system, so you're going to see a message in the display down there when I turn the key on after the chimes finish, and we're going to have to reset that. So we got the engine, the ignition in full on. There's the message. So to get rid of that, what we have to do is go ahead and turn it to full on and depress the gas pedal 3 times within 10 seconds. Shut it back off. And now we'll try it again. And the message is gone. So now we'll go ahead and start the engine. Let it run just a little bit. I don't want to get it too high because I know I got to replace that alternator pulley. Just want to circulate the oil around. We've got no warning lights. Engine temperature is nice and cool, which is good. And we'll shut it off again. And that's basically all there is to changing the oil on one of these. It's actually pretty straightforward. I'm going to have to get this Jeep on a level surface. I've got the passenger side jacked up so I can get to the oil drain bolt and also start working on the alternator. But now that I ran the engine and circulated the oil around, once I get it back down, I can check the oil level and top off as necessary. But now it's time to focus on this bothersome alternator way down in there. And I think the trick to this job is going to be to pull off the right front tire, because I was studying that as I was changing the oil. Pull off the right front tire and also pull off this shroud here. And then it looks like I'm going to have to drop the AC compressor down a little bit. And then we'll see if I can work the alternator out of there. And before you guys do any work on the alternator, before you forget, you want to disconnect the negative battery terminal. So I'm going to have to remove this, just like it says, the air intake plenum here, and pull the battery terminal off. And that way we're not going to have nice weld marks all over the block or a blown fuse link. That'll just ruin the day. So let me get that off, and the shroud under there off, and the right front tire, and we'll see what we got going on. Before I get that compressor off, the one of the bolts on the alternator is actually behind this idler pulley here. So this idler pulley is going to have to come off. And now that the belt's off, I can see that it's nice and quiet. You always want to check your pulleys once you have the belt off, just to avoid any surprises. And that's going to take the same 16mm wrench. And I've already got it loosened up. And it just comes off like that. That's what it looks like. So we'll set that aside. And now you can see that you've got the clearance that you need to back that bolt off of there. Now to get the AC compressor lowered this time. Okay, I got the air conditioning compressor lowered and out of the way. That's held on there with those 3 long bolts there. And before you lower the compressor, you want to take off this electrical connector there and set that aside. I've got it over here wrapped around the oil filter adapter. And to get that connector off, there's a tab on the back of it that you can push down like that while working the connector backwards. And a lot of times on a car that's been on the road for a while, before you even start to get the connector off, they've got these O-rings in there. You want to move the connector back and forth gently just to kind of break the static friction, and then go ahead and depress that down and pull it off. And the next thing I did was I loosened up the lower bolt here so that can come out. I've got it resting here so the alternator doesn't fall down. And on the other side of that bolt is one of these kinds of fasteners that has a tang on it that'll grab the block and prevent it from turning on the other side. And that just goes right there. And then I worked off the, if I can get the camera to cooperate, the B+ connector on the back of the alternator with that big bolt there, as well as the alternator field connector, and got both of those connections. Let me go ahead and, well, I was going to close the hood to keep that light out of here, but here's the battery terminal, and there's the alternator field terminal, or connection, for the regulator. And you can see that's a different connector style than what was on the AC compressor. And I'll show you guys a really good trick to deal with these connectors if you haven't, if you run across a connector that you're not really familiar with, especially if it's in a very difficult to access place. What you want to do is try to find a connector, another connector that's on the car, the same kind, that's in a better location so you can study it and see how to get this thing off of here. In this case, unlike the other connector, this one has a lock on it, and this lock has to be moved upward like that, and then that allows this piece here to press inward, and you can get the connector back off. And on this particular car, on this Jeep Compass, I figured that out by looking at the fuel injection wiring. It's done exactly the same way. The red piece slides outward like that, and you can push in on this piece here to release the connector off of the fuel injector. Just don't forget to put that back on or the engine's going to have a hard time running. And the other bolt that's on the alternator is right here, the top bolt, and that's difficult to access because of this wiring bundle and the frame of the vehicle. So what I did was I've got a 1/4 inch drive with a U-joint down there, and then I've got a 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch adapter on here with an extension, so I can get a pretty good torque on it all the way out here in the engine compartment where I've got a lot more freedom of motion to bust it loose. And as you can see, it's working pretty good. It's very loose. I'm going to go ahead and take that bolt out by hand, and then I'll be able to hopefully, the idea is to work that alternator up out of there by pulling it, lowering it down and pulling it out toward me like this. Sorry about the bad camera angles and stuff. This car is very difficult to work on and access the components. So let me get these things out of here, and hopefully in the next shot we'll see this alternator out of here. Well, I finally got that alternator out of here, and it is the looks like it is the 115 amp. I just took a guess because this car doesn't have the power windows, made by Mitsubishi, and that was a bear to get out of there. The trick that I used was to drop this AC compressor as low as I possibly could without bending the refrigeration lines or anything, and just twisting it around and kind of working it out in this direction, and pulling it through here and then down. Kind of hard to film and kind of hard to explain because you just have to play with it in different kinds of orientations to get it out of there. But finally it came out, and now I want to show you guys what this thing actually does, or what it's supposed to do. The pulley is supposed to allow the alternator to turn in one direction but not the other. And so what I'm going to do is just block the rotor with a screwdriver, being careful not to damage the windings. And I'm just going to kind of turn it over, and it should freewheel counterclockwise with a blocked rotor, and then it should want to turn the rotor clockwise. I don't know if you guys can hear that. See if I can wedge this in here with one hand and bring the camera a little bit closer. The noise was happening on deceleration predominantly, so we'll get close to this and see. You hear that? Very, very dry sounding. And now we'll try to go to the clockwise direction. And you can see that it wants to turn the rotor. It locks in that direction. So we still have our clutch action going on. We're still able to drive the alternator, which is why I was charging the battery, but when the engine decelerates and the inertia of this rotor wants to keep going clockwise, the clutch disengages and it freewheels. And that just sounds very, very rough. So we're gonna, you can see the debris I was talking about, that dried up grease, that powdered grease being flung all over the body of the alternator. And if I shake it back and forth like that, it's got a lot of play in it. So we'll go ahead and work that off of there. And the first step is you can look at the new part to see kind of how it goes together. It's got this protective cap on here. And it looks like it's metal, but it's got a weakened area in the center. So I think I can just get a screwdriver in there. It's going to take 2 hands. Oh well. I'll probably have to get actually a couple of screwdrivers. And pry on the outside of it too. Let me go ahead and work that cap off of there, and then we'll use try to use the impact gun with a 17mm hex. We'll fit that in there and get the pulley off. Okay, now that I've gotten this pulley off, I think it's apparent what the problem is. When you compare that to the new part, all that grease is dried up in there and not providing any lubrication. All this debris, chewed up clutch material and everything else. So I think that we're definitely on the right track to replace this. I'm going to go ahead and set the camera back up and see if I can get that off of there with the impact gun. Hopefully it's not so dried up that it's going to be stubborn. Should just take a few quick bursts. It's just an alternator we're talking about. It's not, you know, body mount bolts or anything. You want to hold the pulley still and then engage the drive. And see if you can just unscrew it. Let me just block the rotor real quick. Wow. I think you guys can tell what's going on in there when you compare that to the new part. All that junk came out all in the alternator. All this grease. So I'm going to blow that out with some compressed air. That might be, yeah, that might be the old bearing seal. Supposed to go like that, just like on the new part. What a difference. These bearings were getting absolutely no lubrication whatsoever, and that's the sound that it was making. And I think we caught it just in time. There's not a whole lot of play in the pulley. And the bearing really only comes into play when the engine's decelerating, when the clutch is basically in the overrun mode. It's an OAD, Overrunning Alternator Decoupler pulley. And that's when this bearing is in effect. It's when it's actually going against the engine rotation, when you're decelerating. When you're driving down the road accelerating or just going at a constant speed, the front and rear bearings of the alternator come into play at that point. So this is just terrible. I think if they were to drive this any longer, or much longer, the bearings would eventually fail completely, and the pulley would do one of these numbers on the alternator, kind of go around like that, and throw the belt and do all kinds of nasty things. So let's go ahead and clean up this disgusting mess, get all this stuff out of here so it doesn't work its way into the front bearing of the alternator, and then we'll put our new pulley on. Okay, now that I've got the front of the alternator all clean, and check the shaft for in play and quietness, we'll go ahead and screw the new part on. Start it by hand. And now it's starting to turn the rotor. And we'll use our impact gun to go ahead and run that down, as well as block the rotor. I'm going to try to block the rotor to avoid damaging the fan. I'll block it with a screwdriver in that orientation in the flat area of that space in the fan. And the instructions for this say to run your air tool at maximum torque. So back that screw all the way out and set your compressor for 90 psi and just give it about 2 to 3 quick shots to get it on there. It doesn't have to be extremely tight because the engine's going to rotate the alternator this way. It's going to constantly act to keep tightening it the only time it goes in the other directions when you're decelerating and there's not a whole lot of force there. So we'll go ahead and finish that particular part. Don't forget to change the direction of your air gun. And we'll block that rotor as best we can. And we'll go ahead and run it on down. If I can fit the gun in there. And that's pretty much all there is to it. You can kind of see this in action. The rotor has enough inertia to keep spinning. If I spin it real fast and stop, grab that pulley and stop it, you'll see the rotor continue to spin for a little bit. See? I can also turn it back real quick and the rotor doesn't want to speed up. That's exactly what it's doing in the engine. And now we'll block that rotor one more time. We'll go the other direction. You can't hear a single thing except for the pulley hitting the screwdriver there. So now what we have to do is we're just going to press our new cap on here, and then we'll go back into the Jeep with it. Okay, the Jeep is back on the ground and everything is all complete and finished. The alternator, which you can barely see, is way down in there and installed. New pulley is put in and all the belt routed correctly. All the wiring is hooked up. And got the top of the engine all put back together in place. So let's fire this thing up and see what it sounds like now. It's actually very quiet. It doesn't have that slight whine that you may or may not have heard. Everything appears to be okay. Let's check our instrument lights just to make sure that we're charging up. Yep, everything looks to be okay. Go ahead and shut it down for a second. So hopefully this video was good enough for you guys to be able to swap out the Overrunning Alternator Decoupler pulleys on these Chryslers with the Mitsubishi alternators. I'm not sure what other engines this is used on. This is the 2.4 liter. I think it's also used on the 2 liter, and I'm not sure which models this particular engine is used on as well. It might be the Dodge Avenger and some other Chrysler vehicles, but that pretty much is how you replace these clutch pulleys. You don't always have to replace the alternator. The alternator in this car is just fine. It ended up being just the pulley. And I've always been a very curious person, and this car has around 70,000 miles on it, and that's pretty much still a little young in my opinion to have a failure like that, particularly because a lot of the cars that I have, they go well over 100,000 miles before they have any bearing failures. In fact, the 420 SEL Mercedes I have has 180,000 miles and still has the original alternator and original bearings. So you may ask yourself, well, why did they install a pulley like this? Why do they have a pulley that's this complicated? There's a lot going on in here. There's a clutch in here as well as a calibrated spring, calibrated to the inertia of the rotor as well as the RPM range of the engine. And it's a pretty complicated piece of equipment. And one of the main reasons that they put these things on here is to address noise, vibration, and harshness, or NVH, in cars, just to make things a little bit quieter. And the idea is that as the engine is slowing down, the alternator wants to keep on going because of its own internal inertia, and that tends to kind of put kind of a back force on that belt and cause the belt tensioner to flutter a little bit and absorb some of that that resonance, that vibration. And so the idea is that when that's happening, when the engine is decelerating, this clutch pulley allows the alternator rotor to keep turning, and thereby absorbing the shock. And when you're accelerating and turning the alternator, that damper spring in here absorbs some of the shock in that direction also. But that also allows them, because of that, to reduce the spring tension and the belt tensioner as well too. And the idea is that if they can reduce the spring tension, they can prolong the life of all the other components, the water pump and the idler pulley, power steering pump, and air conditioning, which is removed on this engine. This is a Ford 4.6 V8. But if you look at the way these pulleys are, most engines are the same. You can see how much larger the crankshaft pulley is compared to the alternator pulley. A lot of times it's about a 3-to-1 ratio. So this Ford 4.6, I forgot what the red line is. I think it's 5,300 RPM or something like that. Let's just say it's 5,000 RPM. If you have a 3-to-1 ratio at wide open throttle, 5,000 RPM, this alternator is actually spinning at 15,000 RPM. Not a lot of people think about that. That's a lot of stress on this little bearing right here. If you look at some of these other pulleys, they're larger than the alternator pulley also. Now on this engine, the idler pulley is fine, but sure enough, the tensioner pulley is bad. That bearing in there is going to look a lot like the bearing in this clutch pulley, but this engine has 150,000 miles, whereas this only has around 70,000 miles. So I'm thinking to myself, what would have caused a failure like this? And I think the primary cause would be the wrong kind of lubricant was used when this was manufactured. The carrier oil in here is just completely gone and evaporated, and what's left behind there is the thickener, which is highly oxidized now. This thing smells burned. It smells like a couple of burned brake pads actually. And being a 4-cylinder engine compared to this V8 engine, that 4-cylinder engine's got to spin a lot faster than this big V8 engine has to spin, so this pulley mechanism would be under a lot higher stress than the pulley on this Ford 4.6. It's also smaller. These pulleys are larger, so these pulleys are actually under less stress because they're spinning slower. So it's almost like what they've done is they've moved the problem from the belt tensioner to the alternator. It's kind of like an inflection point on a graph. You can either have really low NVH and slightly less reliability, or slightly more vibration but higher reliability. Everything in engineering is a trade-off. I'm not sure if I would have used these pulleys if I were designing a belt drive system. They're expensive and prone to failure, and on the Jeep Compass I just worked on, very difficult to get out. That alternator on that Jeep Compass was one of the more challenging alternators I've had to remove. That was a very difficult job, and that's why most shops get a lot of money for it. So we'll see how long the new part lasts. Here's the belt tensioner off of the Ford F-250 that I replaced a while back, and it's bad too. You can hear the bearing. But the bearing looks pretty much the same size. Same inside diameter and same outside diameter. But I think because the pulleys, this larger pulley is spinning slower than the smaller one, I think that's one of the reasons why this failed earlier. Plus, this bearing is not really used all the time. It's just used when the engine's decelerating. So a lot of times, or most of the time, that grease that's packed up in there doesn't really, it's just being slung outward as the pulley turns, and you can see the residue all over the backside of the pulley. So instead of working that grease in here continuously by rotating the bearing, the outer pulley just turns and by centrifugal force just flings that grease all out and causes the failure. But I think overall it was just maybe the wrong kind of grease at the factory, which is a shame. I'm not sure how many failures like this have occurred on the Jeeps. It'd be interesting to find out. But whenever something like that happens, I kind of get an education out of it. That's why I like working on cars. In this particular case, I was helping somebody out. They didn't have the money to, $350 to $400 to do this job, which would have meant replacing the entire alternator. It just doesn't make sense to replace the entire alternator when all that went wrong was the clutch pulley. So I wanted to help them out, and at the same time I got a good education to learn about these clutch pulleys and to kind of think about the failure mode of these things. So, anyway, and by the way, I got this pulley at rockauto.com. Most of the automotive places I've gone to, Advance, AutoZone, and O'Reilly's, did not have these pulleys separately. They just wanted to sell the entire alternator. So as far as I know, Rock Auto is the only place you can go to get these pulleys. And the pulley that I chose specifically, because I've had good luck with this brand, is from Gates. This is actually the box for the belt tensioner, so don't pay attention to the part number, but Gates is an OEM quality component. You never go wrong with them. So that's where you guys can get these, and these are about $55, $46 I think online, and then plus the shipping and it being around $55. That's a whole lot better than $350 or $400. So hopefully this video will help you guys out and be able to save you considerable amount of money if you have this same kind of problem.